coming into the podcast. And thank you so much for taking the time to watch this podcast. We appreciate it so much. My name is Bob Persisepi. I'm the broker owner of Blue Chip Real Estate in beautiful coastal North Carolina, the town of Southport in Brunswick County. And we're glad to have you here today. And with me today is our co host, Misty Sign, also with Blue Chip Real Estate. And Misty services also the Columbus County market in Brunswick County as well. And we're glad to have you on today, Misty, as well. So, we have been asking our viewers if they would be kind enough from time to time, because we don't want to limit our podcast just to real estate specific stuff. We want to talk about things that are happening in the coastal region of southeastern North Carolina,
Mhm.
specifically in Brunswick County, New Hanover County, and Columbus County that might be topical to you. There's a lot of things happening in Brunswick County, Columbus County. We are a very fast growing market. There's a lot of development going on here. There's some controversial issues that are happening in our county, in our
Mhm.
marketplace. It's creeping out into Columbus County as well. We want to hear what you have to say, and we want to hear what you think might be topical issues in the state of North Carolina, in our coastal region. Misty, would you agree with me on that?
Absolutely. I mean, and if they just want to drop a comment below this video, we'll be keeping an eye on it and we will see what we can do. Bring it some light,
Just
bring the light to it.
right. Yep. We just want to talk about what you want to hear. So we thank you for that. And Misty, we've been talking. You and I have been talking recently, and this comes as a result of some of the things that we do in North Carolina in a real estate transaction that
Oh yeah.
may not be really something that folks from outside of our market are accustomed to. I mean, we are a certainly a migration market. People come to our marketplace from
Oh
other parts
yeah.
of the country. We get a lot of folks from the Northeast. We get a lot of folks from the Great Lakes. We're seeing people from Colorado and California, which we haven't seen in many, many years. Which is just is very intriguing to me. But the thing that I've observed, and we've had this conversation, is, gosh, they things are done so differently in different states. My former market
Yeah.
in upstate New York was vastly different than it is here, and you and I thought that this would be a great conversation to have about some of the things that we do differently than in other markets.
Oh yeah. I mean, North Carolina is just so much different. And I mean, we have different language like due diligence, earnest money. I mean, what is that?
Yeah.
So, Bob, can maybe you can explain a little bit more to our audience about, the difference between due diligence and earnest money. And what does it mean? What is it, Bob?
That that's a really good starter question, Missy. I love it. And it is, our system is not customary in other states, and I speak to a lot of agents all over the country, and our system's a little different. There's no question about it. So let's define it. Let's answer your question. So earnest money is actually quite traditional in most states, and earnest money is just simply um, vesting. If a buyer wants to make an offer on a property, they make an agreement that they're going to invest, they're going to inject a certain amount of earnest money or deposit money that's going to be applied to the purchase and credited toward the purchase of a home. Very simple. And in that instance, a buyer may say, "I'll put X amount of dollars into this transaction to show good faith," and that gives me the ability to show you that I'm serious about the purchase of the home, and it's held in escrow by some closing entity in North Carolina. We're an attorney state, so generally speaking, attorneys can hold that earnest money. The real estate brokers can hold that money if they have a trust account. Sometimes title companies will hold the earnest money, but it's credited toward the purchase of a home. And the thing that separates earnest money is that earnest money is totally refundable. You Borrower gets it back, the buyer gets it back if they choose to terminate the agreement with some specific guidelines and specific guardrails. They have the opportunity to recapture their earnest money. with presumably no penalty. Okay. And then there's due diligence money. Due diligence money is very difficult. And I'm watching you, Misty, smile. Due diligence money is a little different. Okay. Due diligence money falls along the same guidelines. It's showing a seller that a buyer is pretty deeply interested in that property to the point where they're willing to inject some non refundable money. Okay. And in some states have this procedure as well. They may not use the same phrase. They may say option money or they may say optional money. But the thing that separates due diligence money from earnest money is in North Carolina, due diligence money is not refundable. You cannot get it back. As a matter of fact, the payment is made directly to the seller. And in many instances, we don't even really see it sometimes. It's a check that's made out, sent directly to the seller. It's memorialized, it's documented, and it's applied and credited toward the purchase of the home. And it is non-refundable money. And it's, I've seen that money as low as $200. I've seen it as high as $10,000, sometimes even higher when you get into the luxury market. So non-refundable. But I should say this: there are two instances where that money can be refunded, and I've never experienced either of them. But one instance would be where there was a material fact that was not disclosed by the seller that would affect the purchase of the property, something that they didn't alert the buyer to that would affect the transaction, whether it was willful or negligible misrepresentation. That is a mechanism to get earnest money back. Or in the very rare instance where a buyer didn't have the ability, how can I say it, the ability to do their inspections or perform their due diligence. In other words, they couldn't get into the property, they couldn't access the property, they didn't have ready access to the property, and it blocked them from performing their due diligence. And that would be a tool to get your earnest money back. So there's a big difference. You've got earnest money, and I'm sorry, I phrased it wrong. You've got if you did not get that due diligence back. Earnest money, due diligence money, separate and distinct. So that's kind of the breakdown
Okay.
right there, and I think it sets North Carolina apart from many other states.
Well, something else that kind of sets us can you apart is can you elaborate on the dates, like on our sales contracts? I know in our sales contracts, they're very specific to North Carolina, and
They are.
the dates are very, 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 very important. So, can you
Yes.
elaborate? The difference that many buyers from neighboring states may not fully understand the
Yeah.
importance of these dates.
We get this a lot, don't we? With especially our
Mhm.
buyers that come from specifically New York, New Jersey, New England. Our dates are quite firm. Okay, they're not really they're not vague. They're clearly
Yeah.
spelled out in the offer to purchase sales agreement in North Carolina. And I know that you and I are always kind of like looking at those dates, you know, pretty
I
carefully
watch
because
them. I watch them like a hawk.
oh, I've got them right on my whiteboard. I've got due diligence dates and
Same,
settlement dates. Okay,
same
so
here.
let's answer the question, okay, for our viewers that are not from the state of North Carolina. Okay, in the state of North Carolina, there's two dates on your contract agreement, okay, and it's a boilerplate contract agreement. So they all look the same. Lawyers don't have to interpret them differently. We have a
Mhm.
boilerplate common contract that's used for all transactions if you're a Realtor member and you have access to these forms. Okay. So the first date is the due diligence date. The due diligence period is the period of time where a buyer has the ability to inspect and probe their home that they're purchasing. They have a very specific timeline. We kind of make it as uncomplicated as possible. It could be anywhere from 3 weeks to 45 days. Give you plenty of time to kind of probe the property and uncover anything in the home that would be a concern to you. This is the period of time where you'll be doing your home inspections, your pest inspections, any other kind of material inspections that you might want to conduct on the home, structural inspections, radon testing, things of that nature. So you got your testing period and your inspection period during that due diligence time. It may be also the time where you start the mortgage application if you're applying for a loan, showing that you're, kind of executing all the processes and moving toward the mortgage as well. And that date is a drop dead date. You have that meant, that it's a by mutual agreement. It's not created by a lawyer or a bank or a lender who's involved in the transaction. It's created by a negotiable um, process between a buyer and a seller, where it gives the buyer the ability to look into their property, and it is a drop dead date. Now, there are instances where a buyer may say, gosh, I didn't get my work done. Can you extend me, a day? Can you extend me a week? And again, that's negotiable. A buyer and a seller have the ability to negotiate that date, but it is a firm date, okay, with some flexibility by mutual agreement. So the extension of that due diligence period must be by mutual agreement between both parties. And then we have a settlement date. And the settlement date is the actual day of the closing. Now, what's beautiful about North Carolina, that settlement date is not created by a closing entity like a lawyer or a title company. It's not a date that's created by a lender, okay, who may be involved in the transaction. That date is established clearly by a buyer and a seller. A buyer and a seller makes that decision, okay? And nobody else has the ability to make that date the one that they want to have that closing on. So, unlike many states where a lawyer might control the dates, we'll close it when we close it. They use that phrase. Lawyers in markets, they use that phrase. Drives me out of my mind. On or about. I don't know what that means. On or about. Why don't you just make it 2 years from now? Why don't you make it tomorrow? You know,
Yeah.
Create dates. It protects everybody. But and there's instances where a lender might say, well, we're going to try and close on Tuesday the 22nd, but if we don't, we'll close on Tuesday to the 29th. Lenders don't control it. Lawyers don't control it. Title companies don't control it. The buyer and the seller, they create it, they control it, and it's all of the other parties surrounding them that work toward that date. And believe me, in
So
North
it's just
Carolina,
basically go
yeah,
ahead.
they work
Sorry.
to that date. So
So
it's
it's just mutual consent between the buyer and the
that's right,
seller.
right,
Once they come together, it's in writing on the contract. It's good to go. That's
right.
what's
And
set
as
in
my good friend
stone.
Lee Brown always says, if it's in writing, it's enforceable. And if it's not in writing, it's
Absolutely.
not enforceable. But if it's in writing, it's enforceable. And so we have no mystery about this stuff
No.
in North Carolina. There's no mystery. We know our dates. We watch our dates. It's part of what we do. It's part of what your real estate professional does
Oh,
is
yeah.
watch those dates. I hope that answers that question.
Absolutely. I mean, the dates are just such a crucial part of what we do. I mean, and as a realtor, I mean, that's one of our important functions of service is creating awareness
Great.
of watching these dates and orchestrating a smooth closing because that's what we want. And we want that smooth closing. So keeping an eye on these dates is a crucial part of that.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, think about it, Misty. I mean, we have a responsibility as real estate professionals. We have a responsibility. We're doing a couple of different things here. First of all, we're likely handling the largest transaction that a borrower and a seller are ever going to have. Okay, purchasing their home
Mhm.
is a pretty big responsibility for a real estate professional. But we have that fiduciary responsibility, a legal binding duty to the parties
Absolutely.
that forces us to protect their interests and protect their, in this case, we're talking about dates, we're talking about earnest money, we're talking about due diligence money. We're doing our job in protecting their financial interest in a transaction. And it's interesting sometimes. Yeah, I mean, our ancillary service people, like our loan officers and our lawyers, Yeah, they're watching those dates too. They've got some guardrails in place too. But largely in our state, the responsibility and the onus to be, protecting the transaction is largely on the real estate professional. It really is.
Oh,
We
absolutely.
That's why we're pretty firm here about dates. Actually, we're real firm about dates. We don't really want to wiggle.
Yeah, I don't live on the edge. I keep an eye on them.
That's in this
I
case,
mean, and
that's not the one. But when you're working with blue chip real estate, we always talk about world class service. I mean, that's world class service. Don't miss your dates. Don't get off the track. But
yeah,
great
I mean,
question.
I want that smooth closing. I do. I want that smooth
Yeah.
closing. And, and I think that's something a lot of people don't realize is what realtors do behind the scenes. I mean, they think, oh, you go, you take people to see pretty houses or, you just do this and you do that. There is so much more that we do behind the scenes that people, I don't think people understand what we do behind the scenes, and maybe this is another podcast that we may need to touch on later
Yeah,
on,
the
is everything
120.
that we do
Yeah,
do.
yeah. What is it that National Association of Realtors had that publication a couple of years ago? I mean, it's been around for a while, but 120 things that your realtor does before you get to a closing, and I'm thinking 120, is that all? Yeah, it's
20.
like
Yeah.
120. I'd be happy with
Yeah.
120.
Yeah.
That is a topic for another podcast.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, Bob, what would happen if a buyer chooses to terminate? Um, how does do they? I mean, what? I know you were saying, there's ways they can get their money back. I mean, so they would be able to get their earnest money back, but they can't get that due diligence if they would terminate.
Okay, so buyers, terminate. Sellers occasionally will terminate as well. So there's a very specific process in place for termination. Okay. So we already talked about due diligence money. Okay. Due diligence money and a termination, interestingly, are not connected. So if a buyer chooses to terminate an agreement, there's no way they're getting the due diligence money back. No way. Not going to
Yeah,
happen, which is largely the reason that the North Carolina Real Estate Commission has said best if the brokers and the attorneys that are involved in the transaction don't touch that money because it cannot go back to the buyer or borrower. So that can never be recaptured by a buyer. But if a buyer chooses to terminate for any reason or no reason, they have a couple of safety rails in place. The first thing is that they must terminate the agreement prior to the expiration date, 5 p.m., unilaterally 5 p.m. on the agreed upon date that they agreed on in their offer to purchase agreement. So if it's
that's
June
why the
1st,
dates are so
that's why the
important.
dates are there. So if they're going to terminate, they must terminate before 5 p.m. on the date that's on that contract in order to have their earnest money released. Okay.
Yeah,
So if a buyer chooses to terminate the agreement, it has to be acknowledged before that date, and it has to be acknowledged by both parties. It's got to be by mutual decision by both parties. Now, a seller really doesn't have any option at all about terminating as long as that deadline is met. In other words, if a buyer says, my due diligence period expires on June 1st at 5 p.m., and they request at 4 p.m. that they want to terminate,
mm,
the seller really has no option. They've
no,
got to terminate
they're
and then
done.
release that earnest money. But the release of the earnest money is very specific in that termination agreement. Number one, it has to be agreed upon mutually by both parties. Okay. And then they have to designate where the earnest money is going to go. They have to say, where do you want us to, where does the escrow agent want us to send the money? Do you want me to send it to the seller? Do you want me to send it to your banker? Where do you want me to send it? Who gets it? So then there's a little safety net in place about what happens if there's a dispute and the seller says, I'm not signing that document, which happens. I'm not very happy, therefore I'm not signing that document. Well, that statement turns into a dispute. Now, the real estate brokers are in the middle there, and the lawyers are in the middle there. Okay, the closing entity, closing lawyer, they're in the middle there. So, brilliantly, the state of North Carolina has a process for that. If they cannot resolve that dispute, the agent that's actually holding the earnest money has to make a decision, and they release that earnest money to the clerk of the court in the county of the dispute. So if this happened in Columbus County, the whoever was holding the earnest money would have to release that money to the clerk of the court, and the clerk of the court would record it, and then it would be heard by a judge. And this happens. It's unfortunate, but it happens. And interestingly, that judge will almost always just look at it on its face, look at the contract, and say, "All right, let me interpret this contract, as close as my ability." And they will just say, "Okay, well, here it is. It's pretty clear. He had the right to terminate, and we're going to send the money to that guy." And that happens once in a while. Does not it's rare, but it does happen. And clearly the state of North Carolina Real Estate Commission wants that decision to be out of the hands of the real estate brokers and out of the hands of the closing attorneys. They
Well, I definitely don't want it on my hands. I'm
I don't
glad
want it on
that
my hand. Right,
that
exactly. You just said it. You don't want to be in the middle of that dispute. You don't, because
no,
now you're being a jury and a judge, and we don't want that. We don't want that.
no.
Now, Misty, you posed a good question about that, because you know this is where education to the consumer comes into place. And
Mhm.
you may have to advise your client and say, "Are you sure you want to dispute this?" Or,
Or
they met all the deadlines, they met all the guidelines. Are you sure you want to dispute that? Or what if they went over their date and they still wanted to terminate? Sometimes the seller may have to say, "Do I want to be kind of jerky about this and keep this money?" These are decisions that they have to make, and sometimes they're a little ugly. But the reality is those dates are very, very important. You said it like three times. Those dates are kind of important, and
yeah.
staying in front of them is critical. But there is a mechanism to return that disputed money, and that's what it is.
Bob, I know you've been doing this for what, 40 some years? Real estate. You've been in real
Yeah,
estate how many
let's
years?
let's not broadcast that to the world. I'm way too young.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay. We're,
yeah.
we're not going to broadcast that. Bob's been doing this
I've been this.
forever.
Yeah, I've done it
But
for a while. Yeah, yeah.
what makes North Carolina's closing different than other states? How is our closing different? When we get to that closing table at the very end, we're at the finish line, we're there. What makes North Carolina different?
That is a really, really good question, and I like it a lot. And I'm so glad that I hope there's a few viewers watching this that are from some of the markets, maybe in the Great Lakes area, New England areas. I will say this, and this is just my observation as somebody who's been in it. I've only been in it for 15 years in North Carolina. Um, our closings are actually much kinder and gentler.
Mm,
First of all, we don't really have closings. I mean, it's a word, it's a phrase, but really it's not the way that some markets experience it in a lot of ways. So we do not do in North Carolina. There is no, what they call roundtable closings. There's no roundtable closings in
yeah.
North Carolina. Okay. And I remember vividly going to closings, many, many, many closings in my former market. And I'm not faulting my friends in New York at all. I mean, I love you guys. If you're watching these videos, podcasts, no fault of yours. But at a closing, their interpretation of a closing, you've got quite often two buyers, two sellers. You got an attorney on one side of the table, you got an attorney on the other side of the table. Clearly, adversarial. There's no, I mean, just the fact that one sits on one side of the table and one sits on the other side of the table should tell you everything you need to know.
Yeah.
You'll have a bank attorney. You'll probably have a title person, and you'll have the real estate agents from both sides. And I still cannot understand why real estate agents would even show up for a closing, because they literally have nothing to do. They just sit there. There's nothing going on that realtor has to be there for, but they don't.
Hold their hand up.
I don't know. I don't know why. It never made any sense to me, and I've been to more than I can count. And there's this, flailing of arms, and buyers are, for whatever reason, they're angry at the seller, and the seller's angry at the buyer, and this is the first time they meet, and they're like, you did this when we were trying to negotiate this, and I gave you this stuff in my house for free, and I gave you the barbecue grill, and you didn't say a nice thing about it. All these crazy things come up. Okay. And sometimes they're very, very smooth and painless, and other times there's this bickering that's going on back and forth that never makes sense to me. But there it is. And this is the closings that many states, for whatever reason, they want to do it this way. I mean, I guess if
Yeah.
that's the way they want to do it, just do it. That's fine. I don't care. But in the great state of North Carolina, we do not experience that stuff, because a seller will come into their transaction at the end of their transaction 2 or 3 days. Sometimes I had one yesterday, Wednesday. The seller signed their seller docs. The closing's not till next Thursday, and the seller signed their seller documents Wednesday. They signed them like literally a week early. They just go in and sign their documents, their deed assignment. They sign everything, a couple of days in advance of the closing. Seller never meets the buyer. Buyer never meets the seller. They never see each other. Seller's attorney never meets the buyer's attorney at a closing. They never see each other. Buyer comes into a closing. All the buyer's doing is signing their mortgage documents, and signing their documents that are specific to the transaction, so that it can go to recording. And it's usually a very, very pleasant thing. I mean, it's a very, very
Well,
pleasant way to do a transaction. The buyer and the seller never really ever meet each other. And when you talk about world-class service, Misty, I think about this. Isn't part of what we do, seriously, I'm not saying this to be joking. Part of what we do is, we want to keep the buyer and the seller away from each other so that they can get together.
oh yeah.
The
Yeah.
more we do that, the easier it is for them to get together, you know?
And
And
one thing I do want to make sure that we kind of point on is for a buyer to get the keys at closing, they cannot get them keys until the deed is recorded.
oh, no, ma'am. Yeah, it's very
And
specific. Yeah, yeah,
I want to make sure our viewers understand
yeah,
that,
yeah.
especially our
That's a really
buyers.
that's a really great that's a really great
Sorry, the
point,
dog's
Miss.
barking.
Oh, I hear you, dog. That's
Sorry.
true. A buyer cannot get their keys to their new home until after the closing entity, the lawyer title company, records that deed at their local county courthouse. So, and all the money gets distributed. The money doesn't get distributed until that deed is recorded. Okay. So that, which always leads me to, like, why does a real estate agent show up at a closing? They're not getting any money, until that deed's recorded. So, yeah. So, if you're a buyer and you're expecting to get a set of keys at the closing, surprise, it's not going to happen at that closing table. But
All right. Well, that's pretty
we
much
do,
all my questions that I had.
yeah. It's kind of nice to hand the keys to the buyer, later in the day, go to hey, I'm going to meet you at your new home, and I'm going to bring you your keys. And, maybe you can say some nice things about your transaction while we're there. And it's a happy time. We want to make it a happy time. Good question, though. Well, I think that concludes our podcast, and I hope our viewers found this to be interesting, especially from our viewers from out of state. Maybe it answered some questions for you. And again, if you have topics of discussion that you think might be interesting, we're always glad to chat them out. We're always glad. That's what this is all about. If there's community interests and things that are specific to coastal North Carolina, we're glad to look at them and we're glad to talk about it. And we're glad to maybe, even if it's a little controversial, there's a lot of controversial stuff going on in the real estate world right now, and we're glad to talk about it and shed our insight as much as we can on it. So thank you for taking the time to watch Keeping It Coastal in North Carolina.
Yes.
We appreciate your viewers, our viewers, and Misty, I appreciate you. You always ask me the most provocative questions, so thank you for that.
Uh-huh.
And we'll see
Yeah,
you
I
next
keep you
time
I keep
around.
you on your toes.
Yeah, yes, you do. Well, thank you so much,
All right,
and we'll
guys.
see you on our next podcast.
All right, bye, guys.